It's me, Jeff, the SP Spaz, back for another installment of Fit Friday, where I talk about um, dieting and health stuff, if you want to call it that. Um, in my last week video, I was talking about for quite a while about my starting the steak and eggs diet and some of the success I had on that. Um, and I want to say a little more about that, but I also wanted to move on with the story a little bit so that it doesn't take too many weeks to get to the to what I'm doing in the present day. Though I don't really care if it takes a while, but I kind of want to eventually get to where I'm kind of caught up with talking about now. But I wanted to kind of, because in the last video I went much longer than I expected to, but I still didn't get to some things. So when I first looked, I talked about how I just searched steak and diet and came across the steak and eggs diet, but I didn't really say, how the help I got from certain sites and YouTube channels and things. So I did kind of want to give a couple of shout outs and that. So what I'm going to do is, when I get to the point of uploading this video, I'm going to put some links in the description to some of the sites and things that I got help from. And I will say that, the number one YouTube channel that helped me as far as starting the steak and eggs diet and knowing what to do on that was a YouTube channel called Anaerobics. And that's with 2 X's. So I kept forgetting how to spell it, but I'll have the link to the channel and to that video in the description for this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why this diet was effective, because obviously there are other low carb diets out there. The Atkins diet is obviously one of the popular ones that a lot of people did for many years and was kind of a fad for a while, where it was like the number one thing people were talking about. Restaurants started doing Atkins menus and things like that, and then it kind of faded away again. And then, more recently, more extreme versions of low carb diets have come into fashion. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit, because I didn't even really know anything about this. When I, again, was just researching diet stuff, I had not heard of ketogenic diets and anything about that. So one of the sites I read about the steak and eggs diet said that the reason this diet is so effective is because it's a ketogenic diet. Of course, I didn't know what that meant until I read, sort of an explanation. Without getting deep into too much, biology or anything like that, I'll just say that the basic body reason is that the human body has like 2 basic ways of obtaining fuel. One is through glucose, which is what carbohydrate turns into in the body. And the other is through ketones, which is what fat turns into. And every person does some of both throughout their life. But most people in today's society, at least in so-called Western society of Americas and Europe and those kind of places, tend to eat enough carbohydrates that glucose is the primary source of fuel for the body. And the ketosis is just a sort of a standby that is used, but is used only when necessary, like when the body runs out of glucose, basically, or runs out of, I guess technically it's when it runs out of glycogen, which is like how glucose is stored. So a ketogenic diet is basically something that accelerates the process and makes it so that ketosis or fat burning is the primary mode that the body is in, as opposed to just being sort of a emergency mode, or just to be used from time to time. And that's why it's so good at melting off fat on a much more rapid basis, because if the body is in a condition where fat burning is the mode it's in most of the time, then one of two things is going to happen. Either you have to feed the body a lot of fat in order to maintain your stores of fat, or the body starts taking stored body fat because it doesn't have enough fat to get the fuel it needs. So when doing the steak and eggs diet, which is also a high protein diet, not all ketogenic diets are. Some of them have much lower protein. But really all that, the only difference that makes really is that protein is muscle preserving. So there are people who do lose a lot of fat, but they lose some muscle also because they're not eating enough protein that their body is preserving as much muscle. Which, for most people is not a huge deal, because it's not like it, it doesn't mean that you turn into skin and bones overnight or anything. It takes a long time to break down muscles. Anyway, so the ketosis thing, I learned all about that. And when I say all about, obviously I'm no expert, but I learned enough about to kind of understand that process and some of the methods that help that. So when you're doing, the steak and eggs diet is what's considered a cyclic ketogenic diet, where you have at least one day every week. And like I said in the last video, I was doing it every fifth day, where you have a lot of carbohydrates and sort of replenish the glycogen stores. And also it affects your body's hormones, like, leptin and ghrelin, the hormones associated with hunger. So when you do that, you obviously are not in ketosis. And when you're having a day like that, you're out of that, but then you go back into it in order to go back into the fat burning process. Now, how long that takes varies a little bit depending on the person. It's not exactly the same for everybody, and it's not exactly the same even for the same person every time they do it. But I would read about tips to sort of jumpstart that process. And there are things like, the number one thing that people say is just fasting, going for a long period of time without ingesting any calories. It is probably the quickest way overall to get your body to start being in the fat burning process, because that's the fastest way to run out of any kind of glucose to use as fuel is to not take any in. So, and yes, the body can actually turn other things into glucose, like proteins can be turned into glucose if the body needs it for particular things. So I learned a lot of stuff about that kind of thing, and I'm still many miles away from being any kind of expert on it. So I don't claim to be. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist, and I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. So please, whatever I say about health, know that it's just me sharing my experience. It's not me telling you what to do or advice on anything. It's not me telling you to not listen to your doctor or nutrition people or anything. Though I will say, as I touched on in an earlier video, there's a lot of issues where so-called professional nutrition people disagree with each other on. So I kind of have that feeling of, well, who do you believe? And for me, what I started to do was more often believe the people whose advice led to positive results, not only in me, but in other people that I talked to or witnessed. So when you have people who will diss ketogenic diets and say, oh, this isn't sustainable. Well, a lot of things, they're only as sustainable as someone wants them to be. In terms of, if it's important enough to you, you can sustain almost anything. So they say that, but when you really go into it, it's not about, it's not sustainable as in the body breaks down in some way. It's just if a person is enough of someone that is going to, use depriving the body of carbohydrates for a period of time as a reason to just go on a binge where they just, load up on carbohydrates for days and days and basically defeat the purpose of that and gain back the fat that they lost. Well, yeah, if someone's going to do that, it's not sustainable, but that's up to that person. There's no magic pill, but there's also no magic, death sentence when it comes to dieting itself. even long-term fasts can be done in a way that is beneficial and healthy. And again, that's something that obviously if you were going to do, talk to your doctor and all that. But people have done it successfully. So even that does not necessarily lead to any sort of binge in the future. It doesn't necessarily lead to any kind of eating disorder or anything like that. So there are quite a few different methods that can be effective. But obviously for me, the low carb dieting, and very low carb dieting, I should say, was the most successful, because I had done sort of semi low carb stuff before, where even when I did the one I talked about in the earlier video, the testosterone advantage, it's a relatively low carbohydrate diet compared to some other things. It actually emphasizes higher healthy fats and more protein, but not to the extent that something like the steak and eggs diet is. And as I started to first kind of plateau when it came to the weight loss on the steak and eggs diet after a few months, then I had read more about the keto diet stuff. I sort of started to transition into more of it was still keeping the carbs very low, but I expanded the foods that I ate. I added in more vegetables and other sources of fat and protein like nuts and things like that. So I didn't stay with the steak and eggs diet for, a whole year and a half, 2 years or anything. But I did go back to it on occasions, because what I did was basically, once I sort of transitioned into that general keto diet, I stayed with that for the most part until I got to my original weight loss goal, which was 200 pounds. Before I get to that, though, I'll say that that the first sort of milestone when I did my weight tracking app thing was actually when I got under 225, because that was when you first are on there, it has a label based on your height, weight, all that stuff, and it had put on my little app thing, it said obese class 1. I don't know how many classes there are of obesity, but anyway, it had obese class 1. And when I got under 225, that was the first time where it changed from that to just saying overweight. So that in itself was like a victory for me, to see something say I'm not obese anymore, I'm just overweight. So that was sort of like the first major milestone. And then, of course, when I finally got to 200 pounds, which I actually did in July of 2018, and got where, the scale said like 198.8, something like that. I posted it on my my Facebook page at the time, last year. And yeah, that was and it still said overweight at that point, because technically, I'm supposed to be lower than that, but that was still, a big milestone. Again, like what I said is my goal, it had been since I was, 20, 21 years old, whatever it was, since the last time I'd been under 200 pounds. So, and there was a lot of other steps in that, and I'm going to get to those in future videos, but I didn't want this one to be as long as the last one, so I'm going to wrap this one up soon. But I just wanted to talk briefly about that in terms of why a low carb, higher fat diet is successful in terms of losing a bunch of weight, losing a bunch of fat. And there's some, again, there were people that tried to dissuade me from doing that over the time I was doing it, because they would, and usually with good intentions, they would see some article or a news report or something and say, oh, we've heard this diet is dangerous, or, things like that. And most of the time, the sources for those things are either not really thoroughly researched, or there's somebody with an agenda to sell the things that don't get bought as much by people who do this diet. So, the bread and cereal and sugar industries, don't want everybody to go on a low sugar, low grain diet, because obviously it hurts their bottom line. So those people who will pay for studies to be done that say things like, oh, you shouldn't skip breakfast and you should have lots of cereal and bread. Those are, they're concerned because that's their livelihood. And I understand that. But so you always have to question the source when you see that kind of thing. Where did this actually come from, and what's the research on it? So I'm a naturally skeptical person anyway, if you didn't already know that about me. So I tend to be much more of a seeing is believing type of person. And not just swallow what everybody tells me about anything. And even people that I respect, and I mentioned anaerobics and some of the other people, the YouTube channels I looked at. Another guy was Thomas DeLauer. And I'll watch those guys, and I think a lot of what they say is very helpful. That doesn't mean I necessarily believe 100% of what they say all the time and think that it's always the best advice. I don't just turn my life over to those people and say, oh, whatever they say goes. I remember I used to occasionally listen to the John Tesh radio show, and I knew that there was, I found out there was, he had such a following of mostly women, but, it wasn't just women, but who basically would be like, whatever thing John Tesh came out with, it was like they lived by their life by it. It's like, and oftentimes it was just some study said something or other. And so they would just buy it hook, line, and sinker, whatever it was, without much thought to who did the study, where did it come from, what was the agenda of the people doing the study, what was the purpose, And it was stuff like things like bottled water is not safer than tap water, and all kinds of things like that, where it was a way to fill time on the radio, not a Bible to live by. Anyway, that's just sort of a little mini rant there, but I wanted in this video basically to just talk about what I did talk about, why that particular type of diet is effective and why it was effective for me. And again, I'll get into more of some of the things that I was trying and experimenting with, as well as I mentioned, anaerobics again. His channel led me to trying some other sort of diets that were his idea, or at least partially his idea. So I'll get into that on a future video also, in terms of how that came about. But I will save that for next time. Thanks for watching, as always. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so, and hit the bell for notifications if you have that. And like and share this video with everyone you know that needs to hear about the success or the effectiveness of low-carb, high-fat dieting. And see you next time.